Hello, friends, and let's get started.
It all started with an ordinary friendly meeting. We're 35 years old. We all have families, jobs, and children. We established a rule a long time ago. Once a month, we would gather at someone's dacha, relax, roast meat, have a drink, and just enjoy each other's company. We have been friends since childhood, and over the years, we have become closer to each other than relatives. So, no matter how our lives turn out, once a month, we put aside all business and meet. We only make exceptions in emergencies. That day, which changed our lives, started as usual, with kebabs, laughter, and talk. The weather was warm, the kids and our wives were swimming in the pool, and we men were busy preparing the meat. When everyone was already relaxed and happy, the conversation suddenly took an unexpected direction. Tony, one of us, shared a strange observation. His son looked nothing like him, not only in appearance, but also in personality. The child was growing up to be a completely different person. Tony said that sometimes he looks at the boy and feels he doesn't recognize him. Alan, who was always the soul of the company and never missed an opportunity to joke, grinned and dropped it. Maybe he really isn't yours? Maybe your wife screwed you over. You know, that kind of thing is on TV all the time. We laughed, raised another glass, and then someone no one remembers who it was jokingly suggested we take DNA tests. Just for fun. We have complete confidence in our wives anyway, so why not make sure again? Went the conversation in a new wave. Under the thermometer, everyone began to reason. What if? We can never know for sure, can we? The only ones who can be sure of it are the women themselves. And that, if you remember different stories, even they sometimes do not know the truth. The joke quickly turned into an idea, and the idea into a plan. We decided to take the tests and announce the results at the next meeting. It became a kind of contract that no one could break anymore. I also signed up for the clinic and brought my son there. A deal is a deal. It's worth saying that I didn't have an ounce of doubt. My son is a carbon copy of me. He looks like me, like my family. We even have moles in the same places. I didn't have the slightest reason to worry. The day of our next meeting came. It was a special evening. We gathered in the same lineup, but this time the wives stayed home. The atmosphere was tense, but everyone tried to behave in a relaxed way. Again, kebabs, alcohol, jokes. When it was finally time to open the envelopes with the results, the conversations quieted down. We opened them almost simultaneously, and at that moment a heavy, oppressive silence swept through the room. Jeremy, one of our friends, slowly looked up and, holding his breath, said, "Thanks for the idea, guys." But Abby turned out to be a stranger to me. A DNA test showed that he was not the biological father of his 7-year-old daughter. The test results were unequivocal. Jeremy was not Abby's biological father. There was an oppressive silence in the room, broken only by stifled sighs and the nervous tapping of fingers on the table. No one knew what to say, but the next moment they all spoke at once. The questions came, full of despair, anger, and confusion. The conversation was no longer about the details of the test. No one was trying to analyze the numbers or question the accuracy of the analysis. Now, everything revolved around one thing. How could this have happened? How could Jeremy's wife hide the truth for so many years? At first, she stubbornly denied all the accusations. She had held out until the last minute, trying to justify herself, insisting that it was a mistake, that the tests were unreliable. But when Jeremy presented her with indisputable evidence, when it became clear that the results could not be faked, her defenses collapsed. The woman realized that there was no way out and tearfully confessed, "The child is really not from Jeremy." The truth was even worse than imagined. The girl's father is Jeremy's younger brother. As it turns out, their affair happened before the wedding when they first started dating. They pretended it never happened, that it was just a silly, random act. But when Abby was born, Jeremy's wife made the decision to hide the truth, and her brother made the decision to play along. They kept the secret for 7 years, pretending the baby was the product of a happy marriage. Now it has become clear that the girl is not Jeremy's daughter, but his niece. Jeremy's wife pleaded with him for forgiveness for a long time. At first she tried to deny it. Then, when she was pinned against the wall, she turned to excuses. Then came the tears, the cries of love, the vows that none of it mattered to her, that she had always loved only Jeremy. When that didn't work, she tried to put the blame on him, say he was too busy working, too busy paying too little attention to her. And when that didn't work either, she'd started to pity him, reminding him of Abby, of how much she loved him, of how he could destroy their family. But Jeremy was a man of principle. He couldn't just turn a blind eye, couldn't live with a woman who had cheated on him for so many years and not even feel remorse. He realized that it would be a tragedy for his daughter, or rather, his niece, but it was even worse to keep lying to her. So he decided that the truth had to be revealed, and he chose his brother's birthday to do it. Everything had been thought out by then. Both families, parents on both sides, relatives, friends were gathered at the party. There was a joyful atmosphere in the air. No one suspected the storm that was about to hit everyone present. When the moment was right, Jeremy rose from his seat, looked straight into the eyes of his brother and his wife, then looked around at everyone else. And without further preamble, firmly and clearly, he spoke the truth. The explosion of emotion was immediate. Jeremy's words sounded like thunder. The woman began to scream, accusing him of cruelty. The mother clutched her heart. The father jumped up from his seat in rage. And his brother, the one who was the girl's real father, remained silent, pale as a sheet. Anger, tears, accusations. Everything mixed into chaos. People shouted at each other. Old grudges were recalled. Threats were made. At one point, a real scuffle broke out. And had it not been for the presence of some more sensible relatives, this family dinner might have ended with the police being called. But it was Abby who was most pitiful. The 7-year-old girl, unsuspecting, played in her room while her world crumbled below. Later she was told the truth, carefully, choosing her words, but it was enough to make her childish heart ache. The girl realized the most important thing. The man she had called daddy all her life was no longer her daddy. He was now her uncle. The family split completely after that. Jeremy's parents had aged a lot in just a few days. The news was too painful for them. Jeremy's brother was now officially the father of the girl, but his wife raised a real scandal. She did not want to lose her usual life. Jeremy no longer saw the point of staying in this house, in this marriage. He felt devastated. Days passed, but he still hadn't taken any action. At first, he pretended everything was fine. He came to our meetings, tried to smile, even made jokes. But it didn't take long for us to realize it was just a mask. There was a pain in Jeremy's eyes that couldn't be hidden. How could it be otherwise? The man he loved and trusted had betrayed him. The girl he thought was his daughter had turned out to be a stranger's child. And worst of all, the one who betrayed him was still living in his house as if nothing had happened. She had no intention of leaving. Jeremy's wife assured her that she had no other choice, that she had a child, that this was her home too. She refused to leave, continuing to live where the lie once was. We understood. Jeremy couldn't do it alone. He said he needed time, that he didn't want to make decisions in a fit of anger. He tried to convince himself that he wasn't ready to take drastic steps yet. But we saw the truth. He was paralyzed by fear. He couldn't admit that he'd lost everything. Jeremy kept saying that he didn't want to act out of anger, that he needed time to think things through, that he couldn't ignore Abby's feelings. But we saw the truth. He was paralyzed. He didn't want to face reality, couldn't admit that everything he believed in had crumbled, that his whole life had been built on lies. He was stalling for time, hoping it would just go away on its own. We knew that if he didn't take action, he would remain a prisoner of his doubts and fears. So we made a decision. If he couldn't get rid of this nightmare, we would do it for him. On Saturday night, while Jeremy suspected nothing, we gathered at a friend's house. We didn't have to talk long. Everyone realized that the situation was absurd. His wife and brother were living in his own house as if nothing had happened. They acted as if everything was as before, as if their betrayal could just be forgotten. Tony, as always, was blunt. If he wouldn't do it himself, we'd do it for him. So we had a plan. The following week, we organized another meeting, no different from the previous ones. Barbecue, drinks, conversation, everything looked familiar, but this time we had a purpose. Jeremy showed up as usual, but it was noticeable that he was tired. He drank more than usual and tried to look relaxed, but we could see that his thoughts were far away from here. At the height of the evening, Tony broke the silence. So, have you sorted out your problem? Jeremy looked away, took a sip of his beer without raising his head. I'm still thinking. Those words confirmed what we already knew. He wasn't going to do anything about it. While he was here, distracted by conversation and alcohol, Alan and a few other guys went to his house. They dragged all of his wife and brother's belongings outside without ceremony. Clothes, personal belongings, suitcases. Everything flew onto the lawn and scattered on the sidewalk. They weren't trying to do it carefully. Jeremy's wife jumped out of the house in her pajamas, screaming hysterically. You have no right. This is crazy. You can't do this. Alan looked at her with a chuckle. We can't? You lied to Jeremy for 7 years, slept with his brother, and forced him to raise someone else's child. That house was never yours. And now you're going where you belong, on the street. That's when Jeremy's brother showed up, as if trying to protect his wife. He stood in front of her, trying to look menacing. But Tony, the toughest of us, stepped forward, grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, and shoved him hard against the wall. You slept with your brother's wife. You forced him to raise your child, knowing it wasn't his daughter. You destroyed his family. And now you think you can live here like nothing happened? Jeremy's brother tried to break free, to say something, but Tony only squeezed his fingers tighter. Alan took a step forward, spat contemptuously on the ground, and said, You have 10 minutes to get out of here, or we call the police and report 2 uninvited guests in the house. Jeremy's wife burst into tears. She begged us to come to our senses, screaming that she had no other home, that Abby needed a roof over her head. But none of us had an ounce of sympathy. It was at this time that I got the message. Everything was ready. I turned to Jeremy and said, You'd better go home. He frowned, trying to figure out what I was talking about. Why? I looked him in the eyes and said calmly, Because now this house is yours again. For a second, he didn't understand. His face went pale. He froze. When Jeremy finally realized what we'd done, his face paled dramatically and anger flashed in his eyes. You shouldn't have done that, he blurted out. But we knew that those words were dictated not by realization, but by shock. He hadn't yet fully understood what had happened, hadn't realized that this was exactly what he needed to do. He drove home. As the car turned onto his street, a sight he certainly didn't expect to see appeared before his eyes. His wife and brother's belongings were lying on the lawn, some scattered on the sidewalk. Suitcases were open, clothes scattered chaotically, as if fate itself had decided to throw their lives away from this house. His wife stood in the midst of all this chaos, shouting something incoherent, waving her arms, while his brother stomped beside her, looking miserable. They didn't know what to do, didn't know where to go. Jeremy turned off the engine, got out of the car, and slowly surveyed the scene. Then turned his gaze to us. And at that moment, for the first time since this whole thing had started, he took a deep breath, as if a huge weight had finally been lifted off his shoulders. His wife saw him, snapped out of her seat, and rushed to him, begging, crying, trying to grab his hands. She kept repeating that he couldn't do this to her, that it wasn't fair, that they were family. But Jeremy didn't even look at her. Without a word, without stopping, he walked past her, up the porch steps, and stepped over the threshold, closing the door behind him. That was the moment when he finally started to free himself. No one really knows what happened to his wife and brother after that. We heard they lived with their parents for a while. Then there was a rumor that she tried to sue Jeremy for money, but it didn't work out. The house was always in his name. Jeremy, of course, didn't come to his senses right away. It took time. For the first few weeks, he was like a ghost of himself, quiet, withdrawn, as if he were somewhere far away in his thoughts. But we never left him alone. We didn't let him shut himself in, didn't let him drown in loneliness. If he missed our appointments, we came to him. If he didn't answer the phone, we knocked on his door. We forced him to leave the house, forced him to talk, to distract himself. Slowly, little by little, he started to come back. There was something alive in his eyes, confidence in his voice. Jeremy was becoming the man we knew. But even when he seemed to be on the mend, we noticed moments when he would suddenly stop talking, frozen, staring at one point. We knew what he was thinking. Abby. It didn't matter that she wasn't his daughter by blood. He'd raised her, taught her to ride her bike, read her bedtime stories, sat with her when she was sick. He'd been there for all 7 years, loving her the way a real father does. And now he missed her. Our wives found out about everything we'd done almost immediately. We waited for their reproach, but to our surprise, there was none. On the contrary, they supported us. Some of them admitted that they would have acted even more harshly if they were us. Others admired our loyalty to our friend. But most importantly, Jeremy was no longer alone. We spent more time with him than ever before. At first, he kept his distance, as if he was afraid of getting attached again, but we kept him close. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was a few months later at one of our meetings. It was business as usual. Noise, laughter, conversation. The kids were playing on the lawn, running around, laughing. At one point, I noticed that Jeremy had fallen silent. He sat with his elbows resting on the table and just stared at the kids playing. We knew that look. We knew what he was thinking, knew that the pain never left him even months later. Tony was the first to speak. "You miss her, don't you?" Jeremy sighed heavily, ran his hands over his face as if trying to shake the thoughts away, but finally said quietly, "Of course I miss her. How could I not? I raised her. I was a father to her. But she's not my daughter. I have no right to her." We've looked at each other. We discussed this before. We all thought it was unfair. And we already had a plan. Alan got right to the point. "What if you had that right?" Jeremy frowned. "What do you mean?" And then we told him everything. Over the next few weeks, we raised money little by little, looked for a good family law lawyer, studied the law. Finally, we found a lawyer who said Jeremy had a chance. He could get at least partial custody. Yes, he wasn't the biological father, but he was the only real father in the girl's life. The lawyer was sure. The court could give him the right to spend time with her, to see her, to be near her. Jeremy shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. "This is crazy. I can't." "You can," Tony said firmly, "and we'll do it together." Jeremy resisted. He was afraid he'd reignite the conflict, afraid of what it would do to the girl, afraid of getting attached again and eventually losing her for good. "Maybe it's better to leave it as it is," he muttered in a muffled voice. "You always said you'd do anything for Abby," I reminded him. "So do it. Fighting for her is everything, too." There was silence. Jeremy clenched his fingers, took a deep breath, and finally nodded. The fight had been long and hard. His ex-wife was doing everything she could to keep it from happening. She claimed he had no rights, that he was a stranger. Jeremy's brother stayed away, too ashamed to get involved, but his silent presence was eloquent in itself. But our lawyer was persistent. He argued that the girl had known only one father all her life, Jeremy. He was the one who had cared for her, raised her, invested his soul in her. The judge scrutinized the case, listened to the arguments, reviewed the documents. And finally he ruled, joint custody. It wasn't a complete triumph, but it was enough. Jeremy was now able to spend several days a week with Abby. When they met for the first time after a long separation, it was a moment we'll always remember. The girl saw him and threw herself into his arms, sobbing, "Daddy, I missed you so much." Jeremy squeezed her in his arms, as if he was afraid she would disappear again. And in that moment, we knew we'd done the right thing. After that, he started to come to his senses. For real. He started smiling again, but it wasn't strained, it was genuine. He went back to work with new strength, with the desire to move on. He began to open up to people, to get acquainted, even began to meet someone, but he did not hurry, did not rush things. One day, at another meeting, sitting by the fire with a bottle of beer in his hands, he suddenly looked at us and, grinning slightly, shook his head. "You guys are the best friends in the world," he said, quickly wiping away a tear before anyone could notice. "But don't ever do what Tony suggests again." We laughed, and so did he. It was a genuine, hearty laugh that we hadn't heard from him in far too long. In that moment, we realized it was all worth it. Time has passed, and looking back, I realize how much our lives have changed since the day we first opened those ill-fated envelopes with the DNA test results. None of us could have imagined that an ordinary joke among friends would turn into such an upheaval, turning the fortunes of several families and leaving a mark that would stay with us forever. Today, Jeremy is doing well. Even more than that, he's actually doing well. After all the chaos he had to go through, he managed to rebuild himself. It didn't happen overnight, of course. There were difficult moments when he had doubts, when he wondered if he had done the right thing, if he had made a mistake. But in the end, he only came out of it stronger. He is now firmly on his feet, financially independent, has taken a big step in his career, and has even moved house. He said he needed a fresh start in a place that wouldn't remind him of the past. All that was left was his faithful dog, who went through all these changes with him. After a while, a new woman came into his life, a smart, kind-hearted woman, one who truly respects and appreciates him. They take their time, gradually building something real, without lies, without secrets, without pain. Abby is growing too, and growing fast. The joint custody we all fought so hard for has been even more successful than we expected. At first, Jeremy's ex-wife tried to put sticks in the wheels, but she realized pretty quickly that there was no stopping it. The girl has always loved her daddy Jeremy. That's what she still calls him. And it became obvious that taking him out of her life would only cause her pain. Now, every week Jeremy spends time with her. They take walks, go on trips, laugh, play just like before. He never misses a single one of her birthdays. Abby already understands a lot, and in time will understand even more. But most importantly, no matter what, she knows she has a father who has never left her. And us, we're still sticking together. Whereas before our friendship was just a good tradition, now we know we're willing to go to the end for each other. After all we've done for Jeremy, it's clear it's not just shared memories that bind us together, but something much more. Our wives are still there for us, supporting us, and some of them still remember that story, saying that that was when we proved that we could handle anything. And, of course, that story still comes up at our meetings. Every time, someone brings up how it started with a stupid line and ended up in a courtroom. And Tony, well, Tony's the same. As soon as he suggests something crazy, someone is sure to look at Jeremy and ask, "Are we really going to do this, or do we just dismiss it outright?" Jeremy laughs, shakes his head, and replies, "We're never going to follow Tony's plan again. But we know the truth. Without that crazy idea, he wouldn't be where he is today. Life has moved on, but this experience taught us an important thing. You never know when the truth will come out. Sometimes it comes crashing down at the most unexpected moment. But the most important thing isn't what you find out. It's who's there for you when your world starts to fall apart." And Jeremy? He was able to rebuild his life. And we're still here, ready for anything. Because if there's one truth in life that we've experienced firsthand, it's that true friends will never let their brother go down. And while we constantly tease Tony and his crazy schemes, maybe, just maybe, every once in a while he's worth listening to. But only maybe. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.